The mare refused to move, even as the auction handler snapped the rope and shouted louder, his voice echoing through the crowded barn like a warning no one could ignore. Dust swirled around her fragile legs as buyers leaned over wooden rails, whispering judgments under their breath. The overhead lights flickered, casting sharp shadows across her painfully thin frame. Every rib pressed against her skin like a silent cry for help, and the faded chalk mark stamped across her stall card read 3 brutal words, "Too weak to sell." Most horses in the yard stamped nervously or tossed their heads in frustration, but this mare simply stood still, eyes wide, distant, and strangely aware, as if she understood every cruel whisper bouncing through the arena. What nobody knew in that moment was that this fragile animal, dismissed as worthless, was about to change a broken man's life forever. Ethan Caldwell hadn't planned to attend the auction that morning. He had spent the last 6 months barely keeping his struggling ranch alive after losing both his wife and his confidence in the same tragic winter accident. His fields had grown patchy, his barns half empty, and the horses he once trained with quiet pride now belonged to other buyers who had stronger hands and clearer hearts. He told himself he was only there to watch, maybe learn what the market was doing, maybe remind himself of the life he used to understand. But as he leaned against the weathered wooden fence, sipping lukewarm coffee, his eyes drifted toward the far corner of the holding pen, toward the mare that no one else seemed to notice for the right reasons. She wasn't just thin. She looked like a shadow shaped like a horse, her brown coat dull and uneven, her mane tangled from neglect or worse. A faint white streak ran across her forehead like a faded star trying to survive behind storm clouds. Buyers passed by her stall quickly, barely slowing down. One man scoffed, shaking his head. Another scribbled notes before crossing her number off his list. A group of ranchers joked loudly nearby, betting how long she'd last before collapsing if anyone even bothered to lead her into the ring. Their laughter bounced through the barn like broken glass, but the mare didn't react. She simply stared outward, her ears twitching slightly toward the noise yet never fully acknowledging it. That stillness unsettled Ethan more than panic ever could. When the handler finally tugged her rope and tried guiding her toward the auction circle, she planted her hooves into the dirt floor as if gravity itself had chosen her side. The handler cursed under his breath, yanking harder, his boots scraping across the ground. The mare's legs trembled, but she didn't step forward. Her nostrils flared softly, her breath shallow but steady, and for a moment the entire barn seemed to quiet, not out of respect, but curiosity. Ethan leaned forward instinctively, his pulse quickening. There was something in her eyes that stirred a memory he hadn't allowed himself to revisit since the accident, the stubborn refusal to give up, even when standing felt impossible. The auctioneer barked impatiently from the center ring, demanding the handler move the mare along or clear the path for the next lot. The handler smacked his thigh with the rope, frustration boiling over. That sharp crack echoed through the enclosure, and the mare flinched, not violently, but with the slow, resigned movement of an animal that had learned pain often followed noise. Ethan felt his stomach twist. He had seen that kind of reaction before, years ago, when he rescued a colt from a neglect case. That colt had eventually become his wife's favorite riding partner, the same horse she was training on the day the ice storm struck the ridge trail and changed everything. He tried to pull his attention away, but something anchored him there. Around him, bidding paddles clapped against railings, buyers shouted numbers, and hooves thundered as healthier horses trotted confidently through the ring. Money exchanged hands in rapid bursts, deals closing in seconds. Yet in the far corner, time seemed to slow around the mare. Dust particles drifted lazily through sunlight beams cutting through roof gaps, settling gently along her back. She shifted her weight slightly, her legs wobbling for just a second before steadying again. That tiny motion hit Ethan like a whisper meant only for him. An older rancher standing beside Ethan muttered, "She won't last a month. Seen dozens like her. Best thing they can do is put her down before she suffers worse." The words weren't cruel, just tired, practical, shaped by years of hard realities. But they landed heavily in Ethan's chest. He watched as the handler finally dragged the mare halfway toward the ring entrance before stopping, waving off the auctioneer with visible irritation. The mare lowered her head slightly, not in defeat, but in exhaustion. Her knees buckled just enough to send a ripple of alarm through the crowd, followed by scattered chuckles from those who had already decided her fate. Then something unexpected happened. The mare lifted her head again, not toward the handler, not toward the auctioneer, but directly toward Ethan. Across the noise, across the dust, across the chaos of numbers and shouting voices, her gaze locked onto his. Her eyes weren't wild. They weren't pleading. They were steady, searching, almost calculating. Ethan felt a strange tightening in his chest, as if someone had reached into his past and pulled forward every moment he tried to bury beneath work and silence. He remembered standing beside his wife in their pasture years ago, watching a newly rescued filly take her first hesitant steps toward trust. He remembered her telling him that horses didn't just react, they chose who to trust, sometimes long before humans even realized it. The memory struck so vividly that he forgot where he was for a split second. The noise of the auction faded behind the pounding of his own heartbeat. The mare blinked slowly, her ears tilting forward, and something in Ethan shifted, fragile but undeniable. Behind him, another buyer raised his voice, joking loudly, "They should pay someone to take that skeleton away." Laughter erupted again, harsher this time. The handler jerked the rope once more, clearly preparing to lead her out of the sale entirely. And that's when Ethan's hand tightened around the wooden railing. His knuckles turned pale, his breath catching as a single reckless thought pushed through his hesitation. He didn't know why it mattered. He didn't know how he could afford another responsibility when he was already drowning in bills and memories. But as the mare stumbled slightly, struggling to remain upright, Ethan felt something stir that he hadn't felt since before loss hollowed his world. He stepped away from the fence before he could second-guess himself, moving slowly toward the auction desk as murmurs spread through the crowd. The mare's stall tag fluttered slightly in the dusty breeze, the words, "Too weak to sell," still glaring beneath her lot number. Ethan swallowed hard, his pulse roaring in his ears. Somewhere deep inside, logic screamed at him to walk away, to protect what little stability he had left. But the mare shifted her stance again, fighting gravity with quiet determination, and Ethan realized he wasn't just watching an auction anymore. He was standing at the edge of a decision that could either break him completely, or rebuild something he thought he had lost forever. And as the auctioneer called for the next lot, Ethan raised his hand. The auctioneer almost didn't notice Ethan's raised hand at first. The ring was already moving on, the handler turning away with the mare as if she were nothing more than a failed listing to be erased from the day's schedule. But Ethan stepped forward, his voice cutting through the rising chatter with a firmness that surprised even him. "I'll take her." The words echoed across the barn, followed by a sudden, heavy silence. The auctioneer paused mid-sentence, glancing between Ethan and the trembling mare like he was trying to confirm he'd heard correctly. A few buyers exchanged puzzled looks, while others smirked openly, whispering about desperation or foolish sympathy purchases. The handler stopped walking, clearly relieved yet confused, loosening the rope slightly as he waited for confirmation. The auctioneer shrugged, scribbled quickly, and announced a barely spoken final price, so low it felt almost insulting to the proud animal standing at the end of the lead rope. Murmurs spread like wildfire as Ethan signed the paperwork. Some buyers shook their heads in disbelief. Others chuckled quietly, betting among themselves how long the mare would survive under his care. Ethan heard every whisper, every dismissive comment, but he kept his focus forward. Up close, the mare looked even more fragile than she had from the fence. Small scars lined her flank, half hidden beneath her dull coat, and her breathing carried a faint wheezing rhythm that raised immediate concern. Yet her eyes remained sharp, studying him carefully, almost cautiously curious. When he reached for the rope, she didn't pull away. She simply stood still, her ears flicking forward as if memorizing his scent, his posture, his hesitation. Leading her out of the auction yard became the first real test. Each step she took looked uncertain, her legs trembling beneath her thin frame. The gravel path toward Ethan's trailer stretched longer than it should have, every uneven stone threatening to trip her weakened balance. A few handlers nearby paused their work to watch, their expressions mixing skepticism with reluctant sympathy. Halfway across the yard, the mare stopped completely, her hooves freezing in place. Ethan gently tugged the rope, but she refused, her body tightening with silent resistance. For a moment, frustration flickered across his face. He had no training equipment, no preparation, and certainly no backup plan. But instead of pulling harder, he exhaled slowly and stepped closer, lowering his voice to a near whisper. "It's okay. I'm not rushing you," he murmured, unsure whether he was speaking to her or to himself. The mare's ears twitched, rotating toward the sound. The tension in her neck softened slightly, and after a long pause that seemed to stretch across minutes, she lifted one hoof and placed it carefully forward. Ethan didn't move. He let her choose the pace, matching each step with patient silence. It took nearly 15 minutes to reach the trailer ramp, 15 minutes of dust, whispers, and growing curiosity from onlookers who expected her to collapse at any second. When she finally stepped inside the trailer, A quiet ripple of surprise passed through the crowd. The drive back to Ethan's ranch felt heavier than the paperwork he'd signed. Rain clouds gathered along the horizon, dark and slow-moving, mirroring the storm brewing in his thoughts. Every bump in the road made him glance nervously through the trailer window, checking if the mare was still standing. He replayed the decision over and over, wondering if grief had clouded his judgment or if he had simply clung to a desperate need to fix something, anything, after months of feeling powerless. By the time the ranch gates creaked open before him, the sky had turned a muted gray, and the air carried that quiet, electric stillness that always came before rain. Ethan's ranch once thrived with movement and laughter. Now it felt hollow, the wind brushing through empty stalls like forgotten memories. As he opened the trailer, the mare hesitated again, her head lifting as she scanned the unfamiliar surroundings. The pasture stretched wide and quiet, dotted with patches of fading grass and weathered fence posts. Ethan stepped backward slowly, giving her space. She lingered at the ramp, her legs shaking harder than before, exhaustion finally clawing through her stubborn endurance. When she stepped down, her front legs buckled briefly, sending a sharp jolt of fear through Ethan's chest. He moved instinctively, steadying her shoulder without force. She froze beneath his touch, her muscles tense, but she didn't recoil. Inside the nearest stall, Ethan prepared a bed of fresh straw and a small bucket of water. He had already called Dr. Marla Jensen, the only veterinarian who still made regular trips through his region. She arrived within the hour, her truck headlights slicing through the dim evening light as rain began tapping softly against the barn roof. Marla had known Ethan and his wife for years, and her expression softened with quiet understanding as she stepped into the stall beside him. She examined the mare carefully, her practiced hands moving gently across bones that felt far too close to the surface. "She's severely malnourished," Marla said quietly, her voice steady but concerned. "Possibly respiratory damage, maybe older injuries." "And Ethan," she paused, meeting his eyes. "She's fighting just to stand. This is going to be a long, uncertain recovery, if she survives at all." The words settled heavily between them. Ethan nodded slowly, though doubt clawed at the edges of his confidence. As Marla administered fluids and checked the mare's breathing, the barn filled with the soft rhythm of rainfall and the occasional rustle of straw beneath fragile hooves. At one point, the mare shifted her head slightly toward Ethan again, her eyes half-lidded with exhaustion yet still alert enough to track his movements. That quiet awareness stirred something steady inside him, something that pushed back against the fear. The brand mark remained hidden for several more days, buried beneath layers of tangled mane and dirt, as Ethan focused entirely on keeping the mare alive. Each sunrise felt like a fragile victory, each nightfall a quiet negotiation with uncertainty. Her condition improved slowly, almost stubbornly, like she was climbing out of a pit one careful step at a time. She had started eating slightly larger portions, and her breathing no longer rattled with every inhale. Still, she tired quickly, often lowering her head and closing her eyes as if exhaustion lingered just beneath the surface. Ethan spent nearly every hour around the barn, repairing fences in short bursts, then returning to check on her like a man afraid of missing a heartbeat. One crisp morning, as sunlight spilled through the open barn doors and dust particles floated lazily through the air, Ethan noticed something unusual. The mare had shifted her head toward him before he even entered the stall, her ears tilting forward in recognition. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but it stopped him mid-step. He offered her feed, his movements slow and deliberate, giving her time to process every motion. As she leaned forward to eat, her tangled mane slid slightly aside, revealing a faint pattern burned into her skin beneath the hairline. Ethan froze. The brand wasn't random. It was carefully shaped, aged but unmistakable, a symbol used by one of the most respected endurance horse training ranches in the Western region, Silver Ridge Performance Stables. Ethan's heart pounded as he leaned closer, brushing a few strands of hair aside for confirmation. He had heard of Silver Ridge years ago. Their horses were known for unmatched stamina, intelligence, and emotional sensitivity. They trained elite endurance competitors, animals capable of crossing brutal terrains while maintaining deep bonds with their handlers. The idea that this fragile, auction-discarded mare once belonged to such a prestigious program didn't make sense. Before Ethan could process the discovery fully, a pickup truck rolled into the ranch driveway, tires crunching over gravel with deliberate weight. He stepped outside just as Dr. Marla Jensen climbed out, her expression calm but curious. Ethan guided her into the stall and gently revealed the brand mark. Marla leaned closer, her eyes narrowing as recognition dawned across her face. "That's definitely Silver Ridge," she confirmed quietly. But if she came from there, something went terribly wrong. They don't abandon horses, not like this. The question hung heavy between them. How did a high-caliber endurance mare end up starved, injured, and labeled worthless at a rural auction? Later that afternoon, Ethan began researching Silver Ridge, digging through old competition records and archived sale listings. After hours of scrolling, he found a faded photograph that sent a chill through him. The image showed a sleek, powerful young mare crossing a desert endurance track beside a smiling female rider. The mare's forehead carried the same faint white star marking. Her posture radiated strength and confidence, muscles rippling beneath a shining coat. The name beneath the photo read, Larkspur's Echo. Ethan leaned back in his chair, stunned. Larkspur's Echo had once been considered one of the most promising endurance prospects in the region nearly 5 years earlier. According to competition notes, she showed exceptional navigation instincts and an unusual emotional attunement with her rider. But the records abruptly ended after one major event. No explanation, no follow-up races, just silence. Ethan's pulse quickened as questions multiplied. What could cause a champion prospect to disappear so completely? That evening, he returned to the barn with a new sense of wonder mixed with caution. The mare, Echo, as he quietly began calling her in his mind, stood resting against the stall wall. He approached slowly, resting his arms against the gate. "You had a different life once, didn't you?" he murmured softly. Echo flicked one ear toward him but didn't move away. Instead, she stepped forward slightly, lowering her head closer to his chest. Ethan felt an unexpected swell of emotion rise through him, a quiet realization that this mare wasn't just recovering physically, she was reconnecting with something she had lost. Over the next week, Ethan introduced gentle rehabilitation exercises. Short walks along the pasture fence replaced stall confinement, allowing her muscles to rebuild gradually. At first, Echo resisted stepping beyond the barn threshold, her hooves freezing against the sunlight as if memories clung to open spaces. Ethan refused to force her, instead walking beside her quietly, letting her study the wind brushing across tall grass, the creaking fence lines, the distant call of birds drifting across the valley. Eventually, she followed, her movements hesitant but determined. During one of these slow walks, something unexpected happened. A loose tarp near the equipment shed snapped violently in a sudden gust of wind. The sharp sound echoed across the pasture like a whip crack. Echo reacted instantly, her body tensed, her eyes widened in pure panic, and she tried bolting backward. Her legs stumbled beneath her, nearly collapsing. Ethan quickly stepped between her and the flapping tarp, raising his arms to block her view while speaking calmly, steadily, repeating the same soft phrases until her breathing slowed again. The reaction wasn't ordinary fear. It felt deeper, like a memory clawing its way back to the surface. That night, Ethan lay awake replaying the moment in his mind. The endurance records, the sudden disappearance, the trauma response, pieces of a larger story began forming. He reached out to an old acquaintance who had once trained at Silver Ridge, hoping for answers. Days passed without reply, but just as Ethan began losing hope, his phone buzzed with an incoming message. The trainer's response was brief but chilling. Larkspur's Echo. If it's really her, she was involved in a catastrophic mountain endurance event. Sudden rockslide. Several riders injured. One handler didn't survive. After that, she became unpredictable, emotionally shut down. Silver Ridge tried rehab for months, but she wouldn't reconnect with anyone. Eventually, she was sold to a private buyer for recovery. After that, no one tracked her. Ethan lowered the phone slowly, the barn lights casting long shadows across the walls. He glanced toward Echo's stall, where she stood quietly chewing hay, her expression calm but distant. A wave of understanding washed over him. This mare hadn't just been physically neglected. She had been emotionally shattered, passed from owner to owner when she couldn't meet expectations anymore, until she was reduced to an auction discard. The silence between Ethan and Victor Hale stretched across the dusty ranch driveway like a tightening wire ready to snap. The late afternoon sun dipped low behind the hills, casting long shadows across the pasture where Echo stood watching. She wasn't grazing. She wasn't resting. She was simply standing still, her ears angled toward the strangers as if she could sense the shift in the air. Ethan folded his arms slowly, his heartbeat thudding louder than the wind brushing through dry grass. Victor stepped forward with measured confidence, adjusting the cuffs of his riding jacket as though he had delivered this conversation many times before. Silver Ridge invested years into that mare's bloodline and training, he said evenly. If she's physically recoverable, she belongs in a structured rehabilitation program. We have facilities designed specifically for cases like hers. Ethan's jaw tightened. She was marked too weak to sell and left to be dragged out of an auction ring, he replied, his voice steady but edged with controlled anger. No one from Silver Ridge was there to stop that. Victor didn't flinch. We sold her after the incident under the assumption she'd receive private recovery care. Unfortunately, once a horse passes through secondary buyers, tracking becomes complicated. That's precisely why we're here now. Behind Victor, the assistant tapped rapidly across the tablet, pulling up old competition data and ownership contracts. Ethan noticed the polished professionalism, the rehearsed calm, and it unsettled him more than open hostility would have. Everything about Silver Ridge screamed efficiency, structure, and performance results. Everything Echo had been forced to survive since leaving them suggested she had been treated like a failed investment rather than a grieving, traumatized animal. I'm not selling her, Ethan said firmly. Victor tilted his head slightly, studying Ethan with careful curiosity. You misunderstand. This isn't simply about purchase price. It's about what's best for her recovery. Emotional attachment can be dangerous when dealing with high-level endurance horses. They require specialized conditioning and experienced handlers. Ethan glanced toward the pasture again. Echo had stepped closer to the fence, her posture alert, her gaze locked onto him. A quiet surge of protectiveness rose in his chest. She doesn't need conditioning, he said. She needs trust. Victor's expression softened just enough to suggest he wasn't entirely without empathy. Trust and performance aren't mutually exclusive, he replied calmly. But trauma rehabilitation at our facility has saved dozens of horses. We believe she deserves the best possible chance to regain her full potential. The words struck Ethan harder than he expected. Potential. Performance. They echoed like ghosts from a world he had once admired, before loss had reshaped everything he believed about success and worth. He hesitated, and Victor noticed immediately. We're willing to make a generous offer, Victor continued, his tone measured but persuasive. One that could stabilize your ranch financially. Enough to repair your operations, expand your herd, maybe even return you to competitive training circuits if you ever wished. The offer hung heavily between them, tempting and dangerous. Ethan's ranch was still balancing on the edge of collapse. Repairs remained unfinished. The storm passed overnight, leaving the ranch wrapped in a strange, peaceful stillness. Morning sunlight spilled across the wet pasture, turning raindrops clinging to fence wires into tiny sparks of gold. Ethan stood near the barn entrance, his body still sore from the previous day's desperate chase along the ridge. Every muscle ached, but the deeper exhaustion came from something emotional, something fragile and unfamiliar that had begun rebuilding inside him. Inside the stall, Echo rested calmly, her breathing steady, her coat still damp in places where straw clung gently to her sides. The terrifying panic from the ridge trail seemed to have faded, replaced by a quiet alertness. She watched Ethan as he entered, her ears tilting forward in a way that had slowly become her silent greeting. He leaned against the stall door, studying her carefully, realizing just how far she had come. The trembling skeleton he had led out of the auction yard now stood stronger, her ribs less visible, her posture carrying a hint of the endurance champion she once had been. Victor Hale stepped into the barn moments later, his polished boots echoing softly across the concrete floor. He had stayed overnight at a nearby motel, claiming he wanted to finalize his evaluation before returning to Silver Ridge. But Ethan suspected the real reason ran deeper. What Victor had witnessed during the storm had clearly shifted something in him as well. She's remarkable, Victor said quietly, watching Echo stretch her neck toward Ethan as he adjusted her feed bucket. Her recovery rate, her emotional responsiveness, it's beyond typical rehabilitation metrics. Ethan offered a small smile but said nothing. He didn't care about metrics anymore. Victor hesitated before continuing. Silver Ridge would still welcome her return, he said carefully. But not as property, as legacy. She was bred from one of our most intelligent endurance bloodlines. Horses like her influenced generations of training philosophy. The words weren't pushy this time. They carried genuine respect, even admiration. Ethan leaned against the stall frame, considering them carefully. He knew Victor wasn't wrong. Echo's genetics, training history, and instinctive awareness made her incredibly rare. But deep down, Ethan understood something Victor couldn't quantify. She doesn't belong to a program, Ethan said quietly. She belongs wherever she chooses to feel safe. Victor nodded slowly, as if expecting that answer all along. Then perhaps she should decide, he replied. The suggestion lingered in the barn air like a quiet challenge neither man could ignore. Later that afternoon, they led Echo to the wide central pasture, the largest open stretch of land on Ethan's ranch. The grass shimmered under the midday sun, still lush from the previous night's rain. Victor removed the training lead while Ethan unlatched the halter completely, stepping back several paces. Echo stood between them, her ears rotating slowly as she studied the unfamiliar freedom surrounding her. For a moment, she didn't move at all. Wind rolled gently across the valley, rustling tall grass and carrying distant bird calls across the open sky. Victor remained silent, folding his arms loosely while Ethan kept his hands resting at his sides, resisting every instinct to call her forward. Then Echo lifted her head and began walking. She moved slowly at first, circling outward into the pasture, her hooves pressing into soft, rain-darkened earth. She paused occasionally, sniffing the air, testing her balance, feeling the ground beneath her strengthening legs. Ethan's heart pounded with every step she took away from him, fear whispering that freedom might pull her back toward a world he could never offer her. Echo reached the far edge of the pasture fence and stopped, gazing out toward the distant ridge trail where the storm had nearly claimed her. She stood there for what felt like endless minutes, her silhouette framed against rolling hills and open sky. Victor watched with quiet fascination. Ethan barely breathed. Finally, Echo turned. She didn't gallop. She didn't rush. She simply walked back across the field, slow, deliberate, certain. Each step carried calm purpose as she crossed the distance between the ridge horizon and the barn where Ethan stood waiting. When she reached him, she lowered her head gently against his chest, exhaling softly as if releasing the final weight of her past. Ethan closed his eyes, resting his hand along her neck, overwhelmed by a quiet, overwhelming wave of relief and gratitude he couldn't put into words. Victor exhaled behind them, a faint smile touching his expression. "Well," he said softly, "I believe that answers everything." Over the following weeks, Victor returned to Silver Ridge with a new proposal, one that surprised even the senior trainers there. Instead of reclaiming Echo, Silver Ridge offered a partnership with Ethan's ranch. They provided specialized nutritional support, veterinary resources, and consultation training, not to push Echo back into competition, but to study her unique emotional recovery and develop new trauma rehabilitation methods for injured endurance horses. Echo became something far greater than a former competitor. She became a symbol of healing, proof that trust could succeed where pressure failed. Ethan's ranch slowly transformed as well. Word spread about the remarkable Mare who survived both physical and emotional collapse. Visitors arrived not as buyers, but as learners, trainers, veterinarians, and riders seeking to understand the quiet bond Echo and Ethan had built together. The once failing ranch found new purpose as a rehabilitation sanctuary for horses discarded by competitive industries or broken by neglect. One quiet evening nearly a year later, Ethan stood at the pasture fence watching Echo graze peacefully beneath a sunset that painted the sky in deep amber and violet streaks. Her coat now shone with healthy strength, her movements fluid and confident. Occasionally, she would lift her head and glance toward him, as if confirming he was still there. And he always was. Ethan leaned against the fence, remembering the auction barn, the cruel chalk words, the laughter that once surrounded her fragile frame. He realized that sometimes value isn't measured by performance, price, or pedigree. Sometimes value reveals itself through survival, loyalty, and the courage to trust again. Echo lifted her head once more, trotting lightly across the pasture toward him, her mane catching golden light as she moved. She stopped beside the fence, nudging his shoulder gently, just like she had that first fragile night in the barn. If you've made it this far into Echo and Ethan's journey, take a moment to share this story with someone who believes in second chances. Stories like this remind us that healing often arrives quietly, and sometimes, the ones labeled too weak carry the greatest strength of all. And if you enjoy powerful true-style horse stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe, because there are many more incredible journeys waiting to be told. As the sun dipped below the hills and stars slowly emerged across the evening sky, Ethan rested his forehead gently against Echo's, both of them standing quietly in the fading light. Two survivors. Two lives rewritten. And one bond worth more than the entire auction ring could ever imagine.